Good evening, my friend. Are you here for another spooky story? Then come on in. Settle in now, for tonight I have quite the tale to tell. Are you ready? Good. Then let us begin. It's dark. You're at home, relaxing after a long day at the grindstone. Finally, you are away from the hassles of your busy day, and no one can disrupt the sanctity of your little bubble of comfort. At least, that's what you think. I hope you remember to lock your windows and the door. Are a few slabs of metal welded together really enough to keep out the dangers that might be lurking without? For past the four walls that surround you, beyond the scope of your sight, you never know what might be lurking. And do you know what to do if that little safety bubble should happen to pop? I certainly hope so. I hope you barred those doors and windows, my friends, for tonight we have another close call story. So gather round and listen well to The Stranger Knocks at Midnight. The story happened many years ago when my mother was a young woman and was relayed to me by my granny. When this story took place, my papa was working the graveyard shift. This left the ladies of the house and my young uncle to their own devices. At the time, the area had not gotten too bad in terms of crime, despite it being a very impoverished area. Back then, the heavy drugs still seemed a distant threat in the big city, and most people knew what to watch out for in the community might cause trouble. With the area so spread out with only little clusters of houses here and there, most people didn't have to worry too much yet with break-ins and unexpected violent crime, unless one of their neighbors already was well known for that sort of behavior. It was a time when many people still left their doors unlocked. Unfortunately, or fortunately, considering this story, times changed. While my papa was a bit slower on the uptake, having lived in the country for all of his life, my granny had lived in several places. More than that, she had relatives that lived in larger cities up north and knew of the precautions urban inhabitants had to take. These motions she began doing herself, including locking the doors. And boy, was she ever thankful that she did just that late one summer evening. Between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning, Granny and my mother were awakened to the dogs cutting a shine, as it were. And that's what we mountain folk refer to as making a scene. This brought Granny wide awake, because the dogs were making some very unusual noises. They weren't the sort of barks given when one of them spotted a deer or even a stray dog. No, these noises were as intense as 2 middling-sized dogs could give, fierce and snarling. Silently, Granny made her way down the darkened hallway and looked out the kitchen door. Outside, lumbering up through the yard, was the dark figure of a man. Thankfully, she had left the porch light on so she could get a good look at him. She and Papa knew a lot of people, and there was always a steady stream of people coming around regarding farm work or to have Papa's help fixing a vehicle. Even though this area was one of those quiet country towns, it wasn't unusual for people to be out and about at strange hours. Sometimes, planting extended until the full moon was high in the sky, and night fishing was a very popular sport at that time of the year. But Granny did not recognize this guy. She did, however, understand the fierce edge to her dog's barking. They knew that, whoever this guy was, he did not belong there, and they were doing their best to run him off. The man was having none of it, though. He swung out blindly toward them, awkwardly kicking at them, and missing by a mile. Drunk, Granny realized. Meanwhile, her snarling dogs kept baring their teeth at the man, darting in and snapping at his legs and hands before nimbly dodging his uncoordinated attempts to shoo them off. Granny's pets managed to actually hold the man off this way, impeding him from going more than a few feet from the barn for a bit. But drunk or not, Granny could hear the man angrily yelling at the dogs and the determined way he was slowly plodding up toward her house. She whirled around on my mother, who had followed her into the kitchen, and told her what was going on. My mother immediately replied, "I'm calling Uncle." Now, the thing about the backwoods is that a good portion of the time, you're related to most all of your neighbors because a lot of people grew up with big families, and nobody'd want to move too far away from where they grew up. This was true in the case of my papa's side of the family, so his brother, my great-uncle, lived with his family not 10 minutes' drive up the road. My mother managed to wake her aunt and tell her what was going on. In a few moments, my great-uncle, we'll call him James, grabbed his .22 and was in his truck, barreling down the road. In order for my mother and Granny to be able to stay quiet, my great-aunt assured my mother she would call the police, and hung up. During this time, my Granny had already flown to her bedroom to retrieve the first weapon she could get her hands on, a small charter pistol that my papa had won as a raffle prize when he drove a truck for the coal mines. Granny had always been a slender, fine-boned lady, and so had not really gotten the hang of the rifles and shotguns her husband's family was so used to. The little pistol, too, carried quite the kick, and she wasn't sure she would be able to keep a decent grip on it as nervous as she was. But she was home alone with her kids, and hoped that even a drunk might be willing to think twice if his eye caught the glint of a metal barrel staring him in the face. She didn't have time to contemplate much, because the moment her hand touched cold steel, she heard an ear-piercing scream and the awfulest cacophony coming from the kitchen. Panicking, she ran back into the kitchen to find the man had somehow fended off the dogs long enough to make it to the door, where he was currently alternating between trying to yank the doorknob off the handle and trying to beat and kick down the door itself. For several long moments, Granny stood, trembling, gun in hand, wondering if the man was going to get through. Even through her own ragged, terrified breaths, and the blood pulsing through her ears, she could still hear her dog snarling and snapping at the man, the stranger cursing at the dogs as one snagged hold of his pants leg. Then, almost as suddenly as it started, the banging and yelling ceased. Soon the barking began to go farther, passing from the carport around to the front of the house. Soon the strange man began pounding away at the next door and trying to rip its doorknob off. Meanwhile, during this whole time, my uncle was snoring away in his room, blissfully unaware of the guy trying to break in not a few feet from where he lay. Fortunately, the man eventually seemed to tire of his attempts to enter. The dog's barking began to quiet too, signaling that Granny's pets had followed the man to the very edge of the property. They seemed to stay in place for a few moments, barking in the distance, before they stopped, and Granny could see their furry forms running back across the yard. Was the man gone? Was the nightmare finally over? A few minutes later, Granny heard the roar of her brother-in-law's truck as it pulled into view, coasting to a stop at the very end of the driveway. Granny set the gun down on the counter before she pulled a Barney Fife from trembling so hard, and hurried over to the door to tell James what had happened. James, shotgun in hand, then nodded to Granny and told her he had seen the guy as he was headed down the road, staggering, 3 sheets to the wind and working on a 4th, and trying to wave him down for a ride. Of course, James didn't stop, as he wanted to make sure there wasn't anybody else about. Besides, as obviously drunk as this guy was, he wasn't going to get very far if the cops came down that road. That is, if he didn't fall into a ditch first. Instead, He decided he was going to sit in the driveway in case the guy came back. About a moment after he got settled in rolled the cops. Granny let out a relieved breath, but that breath hitched when she saw both officers get out, both reaching for their guns. Oh no. Was the man back? She told my mother to go look through the back windows to see if the drunk had returned, but my mother shook her head and pointed out the window. "They're talking to James, Mom," she said, "and they don't look happy." Puzzled, Granny looked outside to see that, even in the pale light given off by the cop car's lights and her own porch light, it was plain to see that the officers were nervous. They hadn't drawn their guns, but it was clear they were both ready to do just that. And they had their eyes trained right on James. It then occurred to Granny that maybe her sister-in-law had failed to mention that James had taken a shotgun with him. Against my mother's advice, Granny threw open the door and shouted to the police that James was her brother-in-law and what had really taken place. Fortunately, this did not go the way some of you listening might have feared. Also, the description Granny gave to the cops seemed to raise some eyebrows, and, after confirming the guy's appearance again, they set out to find him. As it turned out, the guy had been beating their door down that night was actually a tenant of Granny's other sister-in-law, whom we'll call Winnie. The cops actually recognized him because, even though he had only been living there for about 8 months, this guy had already gotten a reputation as a heavy drinker. Seeing those red and blue lights didn't sober him up much, and instead he told the cops about how some crazy wild dogs had run him off from his house. After learning what had happened, the cops actually picked him up and dumped the guy at the right house, where they woke his wife up, whom I suppose gave him one heck of a lecture the moment he sobered up. Of course, Granny was furious after the cops returned to tell her the story, feeling they just brushed it off and let him go. James wound up staying down there for another hour or so, and Granny didn't sleep for the rest of the night. A couple of days later, during broad daylight this time, the man showed up again. Only, he didn't try to beat the door down this time. Granny was about to call the police again, but saw that my papa, who had already heard the story by this time, was standing on the carport with him. This kept Granny from calling the cops, but it didn't stop her from wanting to beat Papa on the head with a skillet she had picked up when she first saw the guy's face in her door window. Granny eventually made her way outside to hear what the fellow had to say. Sheepishly, he apologized for that night that he scared her, and told her what had happened. He said he had gone up to the one bar the town had at the time to drink, as he often did whenever he and his wife had a row. However, he drank well past his limit and, for whatever reason, decided to walk several miles back to his house instead of riding with the others. At some point, he got the number of the hilly roads he had to take screwed up and thought he had made it back to his house, when in reality he was still about a quarter of a mile away. He told her he thought some stray dogs had come out of nowhere to attack him, and he was trying to wake his wife up so he could get away from them. Granny thought the whole thing was a load of bull, but she accepted his apology long enough to get him off her property. As it turns out, the guy really had been telling the truth and actually stopped drinking, or at least as much, not long after. Whether it was the incident where he came very close to giving some innocent women a heart attack, getting arrested by the police, and narrowly missing getting shot by my great-uncle, or something else entirely, no one was sure. Whatever it was, he and his wife seemed to get their issues straightened out, and they turned out to be very good neighbors the rest of the time they lived there. At one point, the guy even managed to snag my mother's horse when it wandered away from the barn during a snowstorm. He returned both her and my preteen mother, who had run barefoot after the horse when it tromped off to explore the winter wonderland, safely home, with my mother wrapped up in a thick blanket and wearing a thick pair of socks that the couple loaned her. I suppose this was one close call for several people that turned out to do some good after everyone got over the whole scare. If one little thing had gone differently, though, it most certainly could have had a far less happy ending. And that's all for the night, folks. If you enjoyed this story, then like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell too. That way you can catch your latest spooky fix the moment it comes out. Also, please check out my Patreon at patreon.com/phantasmalpoppy. Even pledging $1 a month helps out yours truly, so please do, and thanks for tuning in. Good night, and see you all real soon.